Hello and welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is a distinguished judge. He's been a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India, the Chairman of the National Human Rights Commission, and most recently as the head of the National Commission that is reviewing the working of the Constitution. I'm delighted to welcome Justice Venkatachaliah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for being here, and you honor us. Looking at the working of the Constitution, another committee it's called, there's almost a sense of despair. We have so many commissions and committees, and despite the enormous gravity of the task that you undertake, what promise, what hope is there for committees and commissions still in India to make a difference?
Why one more commission? There have been a plethora of reports. This is a question I asked myself. I've been asking myself quite often. But I thought this exercise was a little different. The remit of the committee is not the redoing of the Constitution. Constitution is a given. All that you are asked to look into is how it has worked over these 50 years. And how can it be made to respond to the new pressures that India would be under and the international economic order, the emerging trends of global economy? How do we make it more efficient? This is an exercise intended to strengthen the Constitution from inside, not to change it.
Let's look positively, perhaps, and what do you think have been some of the principal gains?
Principal gain is the stabilizing of the democratic base. This is, even for most skeptic student of Indian history, for the first time in 2000 years, this country with its great diversity, great patterns of its culture, language, ethnicity, sought to be brought under the common bond of justice, of a belonging, of a constitution. That core of it was the faith in the common man, adult suffrage, universal suffrage. This has worked. That's a great excitement. And well, it's true that most of these hopes are now under challenges of reassessment.
I suppose when you look at it at a span of 50 plus years, there is that feeling of achievement, but simultaneously there is the feeling, the perception that there is the pace of decay, in a sense, is far more rapid at the present time than it has been
yes,
from the time of independence, really.
That kind of excitement and optimism and hope has waned. That's because the leadership has not been uniformly high-minded. You know the history of Europe, recent history of Europe. As some writer beautifully brought it out, while Hitler wanted a German roof over Europe, one of the recent German leaders, I think it's Helmut Kohl, he wanted a European roof over Germany. The unification of Germany the unification of Europe with nations at war perpetually with each other for centuries, different languages, different cultures, different worldview. So much so that when Helmut Kohl announced his retirement, I think sometime in September '98, when he lost to Schroeder, some political commentator paid him a beautiful compliment. He said it is as if the Alps have announced their departure. This kind of leadership, the country is capable of emulating a leader. This perhaps is in the neural dimensions of human personality.
Why do you think, what are the factors, do you think, that have inhibited India from producing this kind of leadership?
Essentially, leadership and the society interact upon each other. My personal analysis is this, that society itself is fractured and fragmented. It is not a homogeneous society. It is becoming increasingly characterized by one factor, namely, it is an agglomeration of different groups which are in conflict, perpetual conflict with each other. The society is not able to respond to the vision of the need of a great leader. There are great leaders, of course, there are great men in their own way, but society is capable of being led. Indian society is a remarkable society. See the Indian workman. He has no training. The bricklayer, the carpenter, the sculptor, they simply see, notice, and by observing, they learn.
What kind of pressures does this fragmentation place on the Constitution of India?
Pluralism can be a beautiful thing. Plural societies are the result of irreversible movements of mankind. To make success of it requires great leadership. And today it is increasingly being realized that stable democracies are not the result of homogeneous societies. What sustains really a democracy is the sociology of pluralism, the conflict in society that makes it inevitable for the people to learn the values of civic education, the demands of a common purpose, and then to make a clear distinction between what is private and what is public.
Did it bother you when you assumed this enormously important task of looking at the working of the Constitution that the committee came into being in the context of controversy, in the context of an ideology that seemed to be counter to this very pluralism that you're talking about? Without going into whether it was the case or not, but that was a public perception, that was the larger sort of public context in which this very important initiative is taking place. In what ways did that matter to you?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I was amazed at the reaction. Perhaps an enlightened society should, at the beginning, give the benefit of doubt to a. Now I think, in the light of what we have published, possibly perceptions are different. Many people come and tell me. One very leading public gentleman came to the commission to help us, and he said, I shared the initial thing, but I am now a convert. He said that. But the work must speak for itself. But it had a deterrent effect, particularly for sensitive people. Why get into this controversy was the thing. But now somehow we have kept our nose above water.
You've had several consultation papers that are in the public domain, and you've looked at a number of issues. What for you has been the most passionate concern of the areas that you have been looking at?
Purity of the political climate, purity of the electoral process, the reflection of the pluralism of the society in the institutions of governance and institutions of democracy. We have a stable democracy, thank God, but it's not yet an inclusive, representative democracy which reflects the gender composition, the ethnic, linguistic, the religious diversity. It doesn't reflect it. And unless that is achieved, the stability of any democracy in a plural society tends to be ephemeral.
Let's look at the purity of the electoral process in some depth, perhaps. You can have constitutions, you can have institutions, you can have structures and systems, and yet in practice, when the electoral system unfolds, we see so many perversions to it. To what degree are institutions going to be able to defend, preserve the purity of the process?
The institutional strengths, institutions do change men, but in turn institutions are influenced by men. This is an interaction. You can't say, get the best men. That's always been the cry of the amateur in politics. There are no best men really. It all in the setting, in the context. Systems, yes. Who makes the system? Again, men. Both are important. And at certain bends of history of a nation, systems are more important than men. And I think personally that strict systemic regime will interact, will influence men's minds, and they in turn improve upon it. This time for good systems. Don't trust too much on the goodness of men. There's a beautiful incident where a great internationalist who was the principal architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Professor René Cassin, the great French internationalist. He was given the Nobel Prize for Peace exactly 20 years after he contributed to the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At that time, somebody asked him, why do you think that a Universal Declaration of Human Rights is necessary? The great humanist paused and said, it's because men have not always been good. I suspect that not always been good is a very haunting set of words. Don't trust too much on the goodness, innate goodness of men. You must trust them. That's the foundation of our existence. But when competitive personal ambitions, unprincipled politics, pursuit of unjust gains dominate minds, and they find an opportunity. Today, perhaps politics is the profession or an industry which requires least investment and promises great returns. But at the same time, there are very sensitive, fine people. Even these bad days, there are very fine people. Thank God they are there.
There is this balancing, as we have seen in Tamil Nadu, and again, not sort of drawing you into the specifics of the case, but again, the principle, the philosophical premise of the democratic will of a people, and we're talking very significantly in the Constitution of the exercise of democracy, and the institutional say, commentary on that. How does one reconcile these?
I think once Thomas Hill Green called the will, general will, the impalpable congeries of hopes and fears. That is a slogan which perhaps in strict legal language doesn't amount to much. Constitution reflects the will of the people for the time being. The will of the people is again the political sovereign, is the amending process through the will of the people. But the essential thing is, when you interpret a constitution, you interpret the silences of the constitution also, consistent with the other provisions. And well, we have been evolving.
One of the areas that seems a lack in the paper's documentation that has emerged is on the issue of emergency, the emergency powers of the state and the exercise of this. Is this something that is imminent?
Now, the amendments, subsequent amendments to the Constitution after the 1975 experience have obviated much of the need for corrective action. Well, that's one of the areas that has been being discussed. For example, 356, the Commission has issued a paper on the power to impose presidential rule.
What about Article 370?
370 is, at this stage of Indian history, it is to be viewed in the political background of the geopolitical situation. And I'm afraid it may not be time to rake up a matter which may be more unleash more centrifugal forces than centripetal forces. We have to see for centripetal forces.
You've had a long stint with the National Human Rights Commission, and that is, you just mentioned a very sort of lucid philosophical context with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. To what degree have we been able to integrate in our Constitution and institutionalize effectively the question of human rights?
Well, our fundamental rights chapter was greatly influenced by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The post-Second World War, in the flush of that newfound glory of sunlight after that dark night's experience, the scourges of two wars our century had seen. In this century, we have killed 120 million people in wars and another 90 million in conflicts, civic strife, conflicts not unrelated to ethnicity, language, regionalism. And we have a great burden. The Homo sapien has not shown a strong desire for its own protection. And these are the things that motivated the great framers of the Constitution. We stand in awe of the framers of the Constitution.
This aspect of the Constitution actually being able to ensure human rights through an institutional framework, through an institutional structure. How practical, how successful, how feasible has this been?
It's my personal view that it has not been a very, very satisfying experience. The point I wish to make is that if you take out grand, lofty statements from textbooks, from other constitutions, print them in gold, and make a beautiful book, and give it to yourself. You have given yourself a book, not a constitution. The Constitution needs the spirit of constitutionalism, the spirit of liberty in the hearts of men. And that must be kindled by ideology which leaders must set by practice more than precept.
This interview would be begging a question if I didn't ask an eminent jurist the relationship between the judiciary and the executive, a point of so much discussion, debate. What has been your own position and insight on this, and the more so in the context of a close scrutiny of the working of the Constitution?
Well, this is one of the recurrent themes of friction in the interface between the judiciary and the legislature on the one hand, judiciary and the executive on the one hand. What are the limits of judicial activism? How democratic is judicial review itself? People's will manifests itself in Parliament, and the representatives of the people make a law. Just 5 judges sit and say this is bad. How democratic is this process? How does even a Bill of Rights, how does it not take away, make a shift of power from the Parliament, which is supreme in its sphere of making laws? How does it not take it away from it and put it in the hands of unelected, non-representative, non-accountable set of people who inevitably have to bring their own personal predilections, put that into the scales when they decide? This is the debate. And on the other side, you have a written constitution. It marks out areas, contours, the limits of the power of each organ. And when there is such a dispensation, there must be some authority somewhere to say what are the limits of these authorities. And no other area, no other organ is suited to discharge this function than the judiciary. Therefore, from time to time, a balance has to be kept, and the golden theme is judicial restraint, wisdom and restraint.
And inevitably, this judicial restraint has to come from within the judiciary itself. And one of the sort of the consultation papers that you have evolved is looking at the issue of a judicial service, and looking at ways in which the judiciary can be made more efficient, more accountable.
And even the matter of appointments, discipline, how it should reflect the constitutional sentiment, constitutional mood, the constitutional discipline. Where the country grows that way.
In terms of looking at, we were talking about how civilizations go in cycles, the country goes in
full caravan room. I think Toynbee gave a biological interpretation of the ascent, the decline, and the resurgence of civilization. So yes.
So we've had, that was Bronowski and the ascent of man. Do you think we are, in a sense, in a stage of descent, perhaps, in India before real ascent can begin?
Indian phase is perhaps the phase which in Yoga Vasishta, the Rama's stage of nascence, which before, perhaps you can equate it to a stage, this age of irreverence, questioning thing. Iconoclastic winds are blowing over all established institutions, private, public. They're reassessing them for their relevance and utility. And we are a part of that process. If you use it, the cliche, that churning, social churning. It is not social churning. It is the civilizational content, inherited civilizational content, accumulated thing that is being reassessed by forces of reassessment. Something will come, something good will come out of it.
These processes, you've talked about the significance of institutions, you've talked about the significance of individuals to respond to this and the interface. between the two. In a civilization that looks at time in eons, this cycle, if you were to try and even attempt to put a cap on it, are we likely to see a shift, a change in our lifetimes, your lifetime, my lifetime? Our common perception, our shared perception, is this process of decline and decay. Is there cause for hope?
Your lifetime, yes. In my lifetime, no. Of course, you see the tremendous breakthrough in science, in genetics, in the new dimensions of genetic. I'm marveling at how our philosophical speculations will be influenced by these revelations.
But will that influence human nature? Will that influence
Yes.
human rights, the quality of living? I think
Yes,
those are the real questions.
Profoundly.
In what ways do you think that they will impact
It
that?
is not easy to speculate, but I think overall the emergence will be a greater utilitarian significance, greater general happiness to a greatest number. That is the Benthamite utilitarianism. At least I see that, because today the Western civilizational potential is at a saturation. Just top 20% rich of the world have 86% of the goodies. The bottom 20% has 1%. And not to be outdone, we also have in our internal economic order, top quintile has 85% of the income, the bottom 1.5. See the influence of the whatever we profess and the intermediate three quintiles have 8, 3.5 and 2% respectively. This kind of economic order is a threat to itself. It contains the germ of self-destruction. And we thought we'd bring in a social revolution, a new egalitarian order. The small man who's asserting his place under the sun, a life of dignity for him. But in a large measure, we have been disappointed.
And yet, you see hope in the future. Justice Venkatachaliah, thank you very much. This has been a great, great honor. Thank you very much.